Hello and welcome to this Davenomics video, micro case study on UK energy, water and rail industries. We're going to take a look at the different approaches that these three industries took in terms of coping with this natural monopoly situation following privatisation, in terms of controlling their monopoly power, promoting competition, and finishing with some labour market issues. So these are all good examples. The networks of energy and water and railways are all good examples of natural monopoly, where you get significant fixed cost off an infrastructure, meaning significant economies of scale. It's best for one firm to do this. This is because there'll be significant duplication of effort if you create two rail networks or two water industries. But also fundamentally, you want to have a large firm to get all the economies of scale, because there's such a high minimum efficient scale that you want to have a high quantity of one firm to exploit that. And potentially you need that to be regulated so that they don't exploit that and put the prices up significantly, as they're the only firm in the market. And you see some examples here: energy, water and rail. Got some stats here relating to the national grid for energy, to the power. We've got obviously infrastructure, the pipes, reservoir treatment plants for water, and the rail tracks themselves for the railway industry. Now, all of the industries were also privatised under the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher and John Major. You can see the dates there, starting with energy privatisation, gas and electricity, and then on to water and railways. Following that, with energy, they kept the national grid as a natural monopoly, but sold it to generation and supply, so you get competition between those firms, especially in terms of the household energy market. Your Empowers, your EDFs, and these sort of people competing these days. Previously, it was just one company doing it all, so the government doing it all. Water privatisation has got 10 regional monopolies when they got sold off, but they control their own infrastructure. So there's a local infrastructure with the pipe work and that sort of thing, so they control those. With the railways, more similar to energy, in the sense you've still got Network Rail in charge of the infrastructure, but now you've got rail franchises and train operators competing with one another to win those franchises and then to deliver. But when they do get the contracts, obviously they've still got monopoly power. So that leads us to looking at some of the different industries individually. Let's take energy to start with. So energy, and when it opened it up, they have an oligopolistic market structure. So there's hoping for a lot of competition in the market, but there's actually quite a significant concentration of energy firms here. It was around, until recently, around 70% for 6 firms, but more recently up to 90%. You can see some of the market shares there. Some of the key players you're probably aware of: British Gas, EDF, E.ON, Octopus, these sort of ones you might have heard of. Octopus itself was actually one that entered the market more recently and grew rapidly, getting able to switch to them, acquiring different other firms, and therefore increasing electricity market share from 1% to 23%. So that sort of showed it was helpful in terms of increasing competition, but now they're the largest firm in the market for electricity and the second one for gas. So maybe, we're seeing it's still quite a dominated market here. So weirdly, that dominant, a small entrant became a dominant player as well in that big 6. So there's still actually quite an oligopolistic market happening here, and there could be worries about that potentially. And if you see these sort of investigations by Ofgem, the regulator, and CMA, the competition authorities, have found some issues here. So tacit collusion, coordinating the price rises in 2014, and weak competition in the sector, but also monopoly pricing, people being overcharged, overpaying, the fact people have inactive customers, irrational consumers, and therefore not switching to the better deal. Now, these weren't actually seen as fines. They were investigated as more regulation and scrutiny on them. But it's quite difficult to prove some of these things, especially the tacit collusion, as you're aware. So investigated, they found some evidence, but it wasn't proved legally. But it's a great example of tacit collusion, and the fact that they've privatised the industry and deregulated it, but now there's actually a lack of competition. And hence they did deregulate the market in the 1990s as well, and when they privatised it at the same time, and this allowed people to switch between suppliers, and customers were able to switch up. And some further reforms in terms of making simpler tariffs, price transparency, making switching easier, helping consumers, and that sort of enabled firms like Octopus to enter the market, which we saw a second ago did grow rapidly. So they were trying to get more firms to the market, so it's privatisation, but also trying to reduce those barriers to entry over time, and therefore trying to get more firms to the market, because they don't really want to regulate it. They want to have a situation where the energy market is competitive enough not to have to regulate it. Then there's been a couple of issues. So one of the issues is the energy price shock. So we obviously saw this in Ukraine, reduced global supply of gas, and this pushed up the energy prices with lower supply. Also knock-on effect onto electricity prices as well, because they are integrated markets, and the cost of gas will also push up electricity prices as well. So you had a situation where there's big energy price shock, as you're aware. So you've got a market where there's some issues with competition potentially. You've got a market where there's been a big energy price shock, big price shock. So therefore, even though they want it to be deregulated and competition and that sort of side of things, they've had to sort of step in. And you're aware of this, putting in the energy price cap. Initially that was put in, I don't know if you're aware of this, it was initially put in under Theresa May because we were worried about that weak competition. So those followed on from those investigations about the tacit collusion, there needs to be a price cap in there to stop that exploitation of consumers. Now, that was in place, and then when the energy price shock came on, they also put it up, even tried to have to clearly cap it at a higher price, because there was such an increase in the energy price. I mean, it would have been much higher than the 3,500 per year in October 2022 if they did not put that cap in place. And then the cap was relaxed a little bit when the energy prices started coming down, as you're aware, when the cost of living crisis subsided somewhat and inflation dropped back to sort of target. So you can have a you have a maximum price diagram here which you can utilise. You could draw a monopoly diagram and put in a maximum price as well, maybe at an altitude efficient point to show this. So that's your first market. What about the water industry? So, as I said before, slightly different. You've got your 10 regional monopolies, and there's some ones you're aware of there, and Thames Water and Anglian Water you might have heard of. There's some different ones that were regional monopolies. And each of them really had that sort of natural monopoly situation, serving that local area. They own the pipes and the network as well. So it's slightly different to the energy market. So they had the infrastructure. Ofwat therefore had to really step in. As I said earlier, like if you've got a natural monopoly situation, you probably can't let companies just, especially for something like water being a necessity, inelastic demand, no competition, you need to put some regulation in place. So this is a slightly different one. Energy trying to deregulate quite a bit. Water industry, one where they said, okay, we've got to do some regulation. And historically that's come in the form of RPI minus X and price capping, where they allow you to put your price up by inflation, RPI minus a certain amount. That X value, how much you think, how much they estimate there's going to be efficiency gains available. And each of those different 10 regional monopolies have different X figures. That is negotiated. It's a consultation between the regulator and the water companies, but obviously the regulator will be the one who decides in the end. And really, that was quite aggressive price cutting in real terms over the 1990s, 2010s, 20 to 30% below. So you just aggregate all those minus X's, you've got quite a significant fall in real bills for consumers. Now it's switched over now. So RPI plus K has sort of come in, and it's been increase their water bills now, or allowing the firms to do so. Still capped, still stopped from going up, but capped with an increase of £33 a year on average. That was to try and fund infrastructure and environmental upgrades for those water companies. So it's slightly changed, but it's really good because you've got those two different examples, one really promoting productive alternative efficiency and one promoting that dynamic efficiency. So they're trying to control the monopoly power through that. And clearly they do this through quality standards and performance targets as well. So quality is probably the best example of quality standards we have in terms of water quality, leakage, environmental impact, making sure you've got safe drinking water, pollution of local areas not being happening. So it's a really good example of quality standards. Then it broadens out a little bit to performance targets, reducing leaks, cutting sewage spills, minimising supply interruptions, and having fines and penalties if that goes wrong. So quality performance also managed here significantly. And as you're probably aware, there's been quite a lot of issues with Thames Water. Environmental failures, sewage, repeated sewage pollution, leaks, untreated discharge, poor infrastructure management, and these negative externalities happening. Clearly, Thames Water as a private firm, it's hard to say they don't care at all, but really they're trying to profit maximise. So it's not surprising if they're not regulated, or not regulated enough, they're going to do this. Now, obviously, they are regulated. So what's happened is record fines for them in 2025 because of these issues with sewage spills and water and wastewater failures, and they've been on the news very topically. So it's showing you how it's not just the pricing issues that's here. With water, it's such an essential good for people and households, you have to regulate it even more. Now, they have started to open up to do some deregulation. Now, they're trying to set up a situation similar to the energy market where the infrastructure will still be regional monopolies, but you could then, as a business customer, shop around. And if you could choose other people, other companies, they can compete on price and customer service like Empower Octopus do, to hopefully reduce that monopoly power and hopefully increase efficiency and consumer welfare. It's been opened up to business customers. It could potentially come to households as well. The issue at the minute with this is the limited competition in practice. So the fact people aren't switching, the companies are sticking with the ones they know, and there's very small price differences for them to do so. So maybe the hassle of switching and going around is not worth those savings or that convenience of dealing with one water company across the UK. That was the hope of this. Like if you're a company who operates across all areas of the UK, you have one water company, one set of bills, more convenient for you. So water regulation, one where it's really still natural regional monopolies. They're trying to do a bit of deregulation, but it's one that's heavily regulated. So it's a really good one to show controlling monopoly power and the limits of deregulation as well. And finally onto the railway industry. So, as I said, you're probably aware you've got private train companies at the minute running passenger services, and they do competitive tendering. So they bid for the contract for the routes, and then rather than competing directly, they'll compete for the contract, and then they've got that contract. So they still need to be regulated and make sure they hit performance targets when they have the franchise. There's some exceptions. Open market operators, they're called. Lumo's one, where they are independent of the franchise and they compete directly on key routes. So there's Lumo competes, especially with the London to Edinburgh route, which I've been on, and they have their own fares and limited stops, but it's trying to get the actual competition. You've got two companies competing for that same that line, that same route. Now, there's a limit to that, as you can imagine. You can't just have multiple, like 5 trains running that route. There's a limit capacity on each route. So, but there's some competition there, but most of the competition comes through the bidding process. And Network Rail is then left with organising and maintaining the tracks and the infrastructure and that side of things in a similar way to the National Grid has done in energy. And you see here's Avanti. They've won the West Coast Main Line in 2019, initially for 2 years, but it has been extended. And you can see that some of the routes that they do there. So price regulation is quite key here. So historically, rail price regulation is on things like, well, it still is, on season tickets, commuter fares, and some off-peak tickets, mainly on key routes. So not every single ticket that is regulated, but some of those key ones, as commuter fares, essential for people to get to work. Historically, they've actually allowed them to have RPI plus K, putting their prices above inflation to try and fund infrastructure upgrades, maintenance, new trains, new Wi-Fi, food services, whatever those things may be. However, now I think there was big pressure really on the cost of living crisis to try and get those prices to maybe not increase as much. And they've been frozen in nominal terms as of 2026. So they've just been frozen, full stop, not in real terms, they're going down because inflation is positive. So it's become less strict. So it's actually the opposite of how the water one's working. They've gone more historically on the dynamic efficiency side, and now they freeze their nominal terms, and real term cuts. So firms need to be more productively efficient, try and cut their costs and stay efficient and profitable. There's always performance targets as well in this situation. So you can see some of the examples here: punctuality, reliability, cancellations. Those are great examples of performance targets. An under-tested part of the specification as well. And multi-million-pound penalties have been put forward, and for firms not meeting these. So Northern and Vantive face these fines, particularly for poor reliability and delays. So it's another way of controlling it. They're controlling the fares, of course, yes, controlling some of the key fares and the freezing them at this point. Performance targets I mean, you need these things in place because you still have firms that are, well, they're monopolies. So even though they've won that franchise, you need to make sure they're doing the best for their customers. If you let them just go, then clearly there's an issue. If they're not meeting those targets, they could be removed from those franchises. And that's one of the things we've seen in more recent times. So we've seen these issues, Southern Rail, Northern Rail, LNER, basically been taken out of the franchise and replaced by government control. Southern Rail's a big example. 2016 to 2018, staff disputes, cancellations, big issues. Northern Rail, also persistent delays, poor performance. And we had a situation where East Coast Route was taken over by Virgin and Stagecoach, which failed financially. That's a bit of a risk here. The East Coast was taken over by the government as well. And this sort of led to the situation where it's a limitation, I suppose, of competitive tendering. Like, you're going to have a situation where the government may have to take over if they can't actually, those companies didn't really do a good job of it. So that's sort of the fail-safe there. So in some ways it's showing that maybe that system isn't perfect in terms of achieving the outcomes we want in terms of the public interest and consumer welfare. And therefore this is what is happening. So we just saw that some of these rail contracts have been taken over by the government, by the state, and that's what's going to happen with railway nationalisation. Not because they are failing now, but because when those contracts come up for renewal, they will not be renewed. They'll come under what's called Great British Rail. Now, Great British Rail will control both the tracks and the trains, replacing the so-called fragmented franchises with central coordination. So you're getting all of these run by the government, with the aim of improving reliability, efficiency, value for money. Of course it is. Like, you'd hope that the government would be doing things in the public interest, and therefore trying to obviously protect employees in terms of their wages and in terms of job security, but also trying to provide a service at value for money, money not going to shareholders. But the downside, as you know, is that there's less efficiency potentially because they haven't got that profit motive. They're not trying to get profits for their shareholders. So therefore that is the conflict. And this is a very topical thing that you can bring into your answers about this railway nationalisation as a contrast. It's probably the best example we have of nationalisation. So if you get any sort of questions on that, it's a really good topic to talk about. So those were all those three different approaches really, in terms of those, how do you cope with a natural monopoly in terms of deregulating it maybe and promoting competition, control it through regulation, and this sort of franchising system along with regulation with the railways. Just to finish, think about some labour market issues. So in terms of railways, it's quite a good example of industrial action. Major strikes between 2022 and 2024, driven by real wage cuts during the cost of living crisis. The wages were not rising with inflation. You can see there how many working days were lost, and to strikes a lot, and mostly in the transport sector. More recently, the public sector deal of around 4 to 5% increases over multiple years has aimed to end those disputes and restore industrial relations. And so the Labour government did come in and do that, and with the public sector wage setting, obviously there's a conflict there. That's going to be increasing the budget deficit and national debt. And it's, as I say, the government do have that monopoly power. They do have that power to try and drive down the wages and to try and control their costs. And that's what the trade unions are fighting against through collective action. So it's a good example there of an imperfectly competitive labour market, monopoly power of the government versus trade unions, and maybe a bit more conciliatory now in terms of the fact that the government is given some deals that have been more acceptable, accepting the industrial action that's stopped because trade unions are accepting this in that regard. And then shortages. So there's a lot of labour markets with shortages. I've sort of put the engineers in the energy industry here. There's labour shortage. You've got quite a large growing demand for investment in renewables and networks and nuclear. You need engineers to sort of provide that. There's a big derived demand for it. But at the same time, you have this ageing workforce, retirement, insufficient training, limiting supply. So low supply, high demand, labour shortage, and there's an estimated labour shortage of 200,000 workers of energy engineers in the UK. So I just thought it was an interesting example there of that as well. So there you go. That's 20 minutes on energy, rail and water. Hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening.